Why would someone who's not a stonemason want to join a stonemason's lodge? And it's a question that's intrigued a lot of us because none of the people who joined stonemasons' lodges explained why, except for one, perhaps one individual, Sir Robert Morey, in 1641. He writes a letter where he gives some ideas. But basically, there's several ways of looking at this. Can you imagine if you are, no matter how important you are an educated man, you have studied under the church, you can understand Latin and all the rest of it, and then one day you go over a hill and there is this huge cathedral, and you do not have a clue how it would be built. You can't even imagine where you would start to build this enormous building. Then you ask, who made this? And it's these people here called stonemasons. But how did they do it? Well, they won't tell us. But I want to know. So there is only one way to find out, and that is to join the lodge. And I think almost certainly this is how it worked in Scotland, because without going into great detail, every town had a guild. In Scotland they're called incorporations. And every incorporation, every trade, you had to be a member of the guild, and it's like a guild is like a trade union. And what the incorporation or guild did was it negotiated with the city or the council, the politicians, for contracts to build a new church or a new town hall or whatever, a new museum. And so it was the public face of the trade. And these trades included things like bakers, so there was a guild for bakers, a guild for shoemakers, a guild for metal workers, so hammermen, a guild for people who made hats, and there was also a guild for stonemasons. The problem in Scotland was that although the secrets of a baker could be transferred within the guild, because it was only bakers that were members of that guild, in the stonemasons' guild, there were many other trades like glaziers, or people who built roofs, people who do plumbing, everything apart from build from stone. So to transfer the secrets of a stonemason from one generation to another generation of stonemasons couldn't take place in a guild, because there were people who were not stonemasons there. So amongst all the guilds, only the stonemasons had this extra organization called a lodge. So everyone knew about the guild. It was public. The lodge was secret, and it was kept secret deliberately because they only wanted stonemasons to become members. But as soon as somebody said to them, and this aristocrat said, you know, these are the people who built that cathedral, he wanted to know how to do it, and he could only get it one way, and that was by joining the lodge. What they did in Scotland was, and you can think about this in many ways, because as a stonemason you became an entered apprentice, and that took 7 years before you could become a fellow of craft, the next degree. It was 7 years you had to wait. But you can't tell a duke or an earl, come back in 7 years and we'll give you your second degree. So in good typical Scottish fashion, they said, okay, you're not a stonemason, you can join the lodge, but you have to pay 5 times the amount of a stonemason, you know, and then you can join the lodge. So it was a trade-off between the lodge getting money and allowing people who were not stonemasons to get the secrets. And remember, when we looked at the ritual earlier, whether they got all the secrets, we don't know. The stonemasons may have had a special meeting for someone who was not a stonemason, and we don't know what they told them. They might have told them very, very little. We don't know. But I think it was simply curiosity. Curiosity, yeah. If you go to Rosslyn Chapel, you will be surprised at the size. It is very small. It's really not much bigger than this room inside. Maybe a bit wider, but not much. It's not big. And that's because it was never finished. It was only the choir. You know how most churches are built in the form of a cross. The top is called the choir. The cross part are the naves, and the long tail is the transept. They only ever built the choir. The foundations of the rest of the church are actually in place. So so if you looked at it from above, you can see from an aeroplane, you can see where the rest of the church has not been built. So this is a normal, typical church design. When you go to Rosslyn Chapel, the first thing I say to people who think that Rosslyn Chapel is a Masonic building, I ask them to point out the Masonic symbols. I ask them, where's the letter G? Where's the square? Where's the compass? There are none of these normal Masonic symbols anywhere in the chapel. None. None whatsoever. What has happened is, instead, we've had people who have come to an opinion that there are some carvings that convey a Masonic message. And this is the most common one. I don't know what I did with my pointer. Oh, here it is. Sorry, this is not my best quality picture, but you can see just, I think, that this is two figures. This one here appears to be wearing a blindfold. You can see that there is a rope, or seems to be a rope, running down, and it's being held by this man here. You can see his arm, his elbow, his hand. And it seems that he is leading a candidate into a lodge. Now, I can understand that interpretation. My difficulty is that when you look at the ritual that you looked at today, there is nothing at all about a blindfold, and there is nothing at all about a rope. These are all 18th century additions to the ritual. Even the printed ritual, I think the first reference to a rope is in 1730. However, apart from that, what the problem I have with interpreting Rosslyn Chapel is that people have gone to this building as a Freemason on the assumption that the building is Masonic, and therefore they must find Masonic interpretations of what they see. If I go to the church as a Roman Catholic, then I see it as a Roman Catholic, and I can see that it's a Roman Catholic collegiate, called a collegiate church. Now, and I know you're all going to do this when you get home tonight. You're going to get out the New Testament, and you're going to read the Gospel of St. Matthew, because Rosslyn Chapel is dedicated to St. Matthew. William St. Clair of Rosslyn chose St. Matthew as the patron saint of the St. Clair family. The Gospel of St. Matthew talks frequently about blindness, about being blind, spiritually blind, morally blind, religiously blind, and even, as I say, just actually physically blind. Now, in the medieval period, and this occurs in carvings and in paintings, in order to show that someone was blind, you put a blindfold over their eyes. And that showed that that person, whether it was in a painting or on stained glass or in a carving, was blind. And, of course, the most famous quote from St. Matthew is, the blind leading the blind. And of course, the blind lead the blind by tying a rope between their necks so they walk in a line. And so they go. And when you read them, and they also talk, St. Matthew talks about, I think about Jesus saying, you ignore the Sanhedrin, they are blind, they cannot see. And so when you remember that this building is entirely devoted to the worship of this particular saint, who is really into blindness, then I can see why this is probably not Masonic, but is actually a biblical reference to the Gospel of St. Matthew. And there is where that is where my problem arises, is because in this day and age we no longer understand medieval Roman Catholic symbolism. Whereas if you got a Roman Catholic priest, I'm sure he would support me, in my opinion, as to that description. And so you have to simply be careful about how you approach anything. You should never approach something with a preconceived idea. And that's been the problem with a lot of these books. They've gone there on the assumption that this is a Masonic building, and therefore they see Masonic things that aren't actually there. The first one about implanting ideas into Freemasonry is one that fascinates me personally. We never got round to talking about this, so again, bear with me. You end up with a fairly long answer to a question, but it's very important. In 1550, a man by the name of William Schaw was born. Now, William Schaw was the son of a minor member of the aristocracy, a laird, which is pretty low in aristocratic terms. But he became a page boy to the king, King James VI of Scotland, James I of Britain. And William Schaw was obviously a very well trusted man, because in 1583 he was made the king's Master of Works. And a Master of Works to the king is someone who is responsible for looking after all the buildings that the royal family might use. So all the castles and all the palaces and all the hunting lodges, anything that the royal family might go to, was his responsibility. He had to repair and maintain them, and occasionally build a new one. That meant he was in direct contact almost on a daily basis with stonemasons. And we know this because the accounts, you notice, whenever you're talking about Scots and money, you also have the record of the money being paid. And so we still have William Schaw signing money to stonemasons for work that he had asked them to do. But he's a very important man for other reasons. He was a diplomat, and he was actually taken in the retinue of James VI to marry Anne of Denmark. So he was obviously a very trusted civil servant, but he was not even a knight, but he was, as I say, he was very trusted. Now, he goes with King James to bring Anne and he attends the marriage of Anne of Denmark to James VI. James VI then sends William Schaw back to Scotland to make the marriage arrangements in Scotland. In those days, especially when they were royal families, you had two weddings. One in the one country and one in the other country, so the population could see they were both married. And so William Schaw was sent back to Scotland to arrange the Scottish marriage of James VI and Anne of Denmark. So he was obviously a very highly trusted and sort of respected individual. Now, We also know he travelled in France and all sorts of other things. But he's remembered most for two things, for two documents. The first one is dated the 28th of December, 1598, and the second one is dated the 28th of December, 1599. And these are now known as the Schaw Statutes. And they've been published, and they're fairly easily available. Grand Lodge of Scotland have published them in the yearbooks and what have you. And what they are, when you read them, they appear to be sets of health and safety regulations for stonemasons. Because he talks about the need to make sure that scaffolding is well maintained, that the tools are sharp. He sets minimum periods of apprenticeship, all that kind of thing. Now, the interesting thing for me is the date of the 28th of December, because all the lodges, all these old lodge records show that they had their annual meeting on the 27th of December. And the 27th of December is the feast day of St. John the Evangelist. Okay? And the reason why the stonemasons of Scotland have St. John the Evangelist and not St. John the Baptist is because before the Reformation, when they became a guild, the city gave them the Isle of St. John the Evangelist to worship at, essentially. So in Scotland, the stonemasons' patron saint is St. John the Evangelist. Now, when you read, and remember, this is William Schaw as a civil servant, when you read the statutes, what he's done is he's written a minute of the meeting that had already taken place. In other words, he is telling them, yesterday, this is what we discussed, and in good civil service style, he's telling them in writing, this is so that you don't forget that this is what we agreed to do. Now, that means, in my mind, he must have been a member of the lodge. Because, he's not going to write these regulations knowing that 364 days are to pass before the lodge can read them. So the dates are too close for that. So, however, I know it's getting a bit long-winded, but these two documents exist, and and they were sent to every known lodge in Scotland, and they exist. They have been glued into the front covers of the minute books of the early lodges, and we've got maybe 5 or 6 different copies. And he actually says at the very end of the statutes, a copy of this is to be sent to every lodge in this kingdom. So every lodge got a copy of the statutes. Now, what's important from our point of view here is there is there's several sections that simply do not have any sense to them at all. First, we talked about the guild or the incorporation. This was the economic powerhouse of stonemasons. So all the people in the incorporation should receive these instructions, but he only sent them to the people in the lodge. So his message only went to a certain number of people, not to everyone. So we think that he has used these statutes to hide certain messages, and it's when you read them that you begin to understand. Now, the very first one is nothing to do with health and safety at all. It says that henceforth all the sworn brothers here present will live charitably together, and words like that. But it's clear from the word sworn brethren that these are people who have taken an oath. Right? So it's addressed only to people who have taken an oath. So in other words, everyone in the lodge, of course, has taken an oath when they joined. So it's only sworn brethren that he's speaking to. Then comes a very, very important thing where it says, every year the warden, which in those days was the master of the lodge, every year the warden of the lodge will take aside every member of the lodge and test them in the art of memory. Okay? And this is a very significant phrase. And what's more, he obviously knew his countrymen very well, because what he said was, for every point of failure, you will fine an entered apprentice 10 shillings and a fellow of craft 20 shillings. So how do you get a Scotsman to do something he doesn't want to do? Well, you threaten to take money off him, of course. So, he knew his countrymen well. I'll make them remember. I'll make them, otherwise they will pay. And if it was just a word, just one word or one handshake, then there would be no need to say for every point of failure. So this is a substantial body of information that the members of the lodge had to memorize. Now, what we're talking about here is essentially Hermeticism, and I'm not a huge expert on this, but part of Hermetic teaching, or the way of, sorry, let's get this right. The art of memory within Hermetic thinking is to imagine a building, and everything in that building reminds you of a certain piece of text. Now, this is how the classic Greeks would remember a book. So if you wanted someone, because they didn't have written books, if you wanted a book or to be someone to read you a book, you would get someone who was a master of the art of memory to come to your house after dinner, and he would read you, a chapter from the Odyssey or the Iliad or whatever. And this is a method of memorizing something. And of course, it is ideal for people who cannot read and write. And how it works is that you choose a building, usually of your own choosing, and you work out a mental route as to the way you go around the building. That gives you the chapters that you must follow in the book. And then you go into a room, a chapter of the book, and in that room there are certain objects, and these objects remind you of the paragraphs of the chapter. And so, it sounds very, very cumbersome to us, but it was extremely efficient in the ability to store a huge number of words just by remembering a symbol that gave you the next paragraph of your book. Now, William Schaw is described by English spies in the English court of Queen Elizabeth I as being a master of the art of memory. That meant, master meant teacher. He had the ability to teach Hermetic thought ways of thinking. What is more interesting is in the court at the time, there are two other masters of the art of memory. One of them is called Fowler, and I can't recall the third, which is really quite bad of me. But these three masters of the art of memory are in the royal court, and they surround the king. They meet each other every day, and they probably report to the king every day. And the fact that the English spies are reporting that these three masters of the art of memory are in very close contact with the king suggests that they were aware that he is being taught Hermeticism from masters of the Hermetic art. And so in some ways, I suspect that William Schaw, when he essentially reorganized these stonemasons' lodges, he implanted Hermetic thinking within the ritual. And what he was asking them to memorize was in fact the ritual that we discussed earlier on. And of course, memorizing the ritual meant that it was never written down. And that's why it was over 100 years before the first ritual appears. And even today in Scotland, if you have to read the ritual, you're considered to be a failure. You must memorize the ritual. Otherwise, you have failed William Shaw's test, right? So that's why I think, we don't need mystery like this. There is already more than enough mystery within Freemasonry that we have barely begun to unravel. And this is one classic example of how one individual who has a very special way of thinking uses an existing organization to plant his own ideas within it. And here is the final killer fact, if you like. William Schaw was a Roman Catholic. You imagine the new Pope being told, Francis, one of your flock invented Freemasonry.